I'll share my screen just so people can see online, but I don't have a monitor out here. Sorry. We'll do our best though. So welcome to Friends, Food, and Faith. So this is a once a month. This kind of is in conjunction with Bother the Father, right? So those who haven't been here before, Friends, Food, and Faith is more of a guided topic discussion, right? Where Bother the Father is more an open forum. So it really asking questions you want. So tonight, I thought being June, where we're also celebrating Pride, it might be a good discussion to learn about why the church sees what she does about LGBTQIA issues. What's that, Monsignor?
You have to pick a place either. I mean, right now the calendar has you meeting in the basement.
Is anyone using it out here though?
No, but I'm just saying, what if we? But no one said anything. But if I had wanted to use it,
We'll move for you. Sorry.
we got yours. You're fine, huh? I didn't know it was out. It was working fine. You know it was out?
What?
Gym air conditioning?
No.
Totally out. No MC.
Oh, that's news to me.
Who told you this?
Well, who tried to use it last when we tried to use it last Tuesday?
It worked all the way up until we got it. We got 8th grade there. It all worked fine. Used it all over.
It's better. Somebody to check it out. Cancel practice today.
You spent $5,000.
Well,
Didn't get to as far as what's the topic again? No one said anything at the end.
We will reestablish in a second because we're done with the side conversation.
I know what you speak. I don't know the name.
You did put it on the document. Oh, yeah. Why does the church?
Whatever my phone was out. All right.
So to reiterate, I think it'd be a good topic to discuss tonight. What the church why the church teaches what she does about what's maybe more colloquially used today as LGBTQIA plus issues, right? Being that we're in the month of June, I think it's kind of pertinent in some ways, right? To kind of understand what we teach as a church, and also to evangelize and actually like kind of engage with our brothers and sisters who experience what we call same-sex attraction, right? But also that can be used for either people that actually also suffer from gender dysphoria, right? So this is kind of a very broad topic. I would imagine also it probably hits home for a lot of people. I mean, I think many of us know or have family that maybe experienced this in some way. I just found out recently that I have someone in my family who experienced gender dysphoria. And I think the guiding principle here is we always have to understand that we approach these things with compassion and charity. We don't condemn anybody. We don't, we don't really kind of look down upon anybody who experiences these things. But we also have to understand we have to uphold the truth too. So that's always important. The first thing I'll say about this is a lot of this information comes from this book called Living the Truth in Love. It comes from Father Paul Chek, who was actually the director of Courage and Encourage. So does anyone know what Courage and Encourage is? Does anyone have heard that organization? Okay. Well, it's a Catholic organization that ministers specifically to people experiencing same-sex attraction and their loved ones, right? So I'll think of it sort of, it's not like a conversion therapy thing, right? It's really kind of meeting people where they are, because what we understand as a church is there's a big discussion whether this comes from a nature or nurture. In other words, it's an open question whether someone is born experiencing this, has these tendencies, or if that's something that's developed over time. Really, there's not enough data to actually conclude where this comes from. But our response is, it doesn't matter, right? You are not just defined by who you're attracted to, or what you're aroused by, or anything else. That is a very minimalistic understanding of what the human person is. We are called as human beings, not just by God, but just the fact that human beings, to be much more than that. Because we would understand as a Catholic Church that because you're made in the image and likeness of God, that elevates your very dignity above just your base desires, right? And whether you're attracted to men or women, or you're heterosexual or homosexual, That doesn't matter because we're all called to the same thing, living in this life. And that primary goal is what we call chastity. Now, a lot of times these terms get confused, right? When I say chastity, what maybe comes to mind?
Celibacy.
Celibacy.
Which is different.
That's different. That's true. But celibacy is often used synonymously with chastity, right? What else? Abstinence. That's also different than chastity.
Being true to your marriage and
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. So
Staying
monogamy,
within monogamy, yeah.
right? That's also, yeah, that's kind of looked on as chastity. Probably more particularly though, that we would say continence, right? Or incontinence, really, in this case, right? Which is also different than chastity. Right? So we're going to talk about all these different terms and what the differences are. But the guiding principle for all these things we're talking about is chastity. That is a virtue. And it falls under the cardinal virtue of temperance. So who can maybe give you a good definition of temperance?
Moderation in all things.
Moderation in all things. Self-mastery, right? That's really at the heart of temperance. That's what temperance is. It's a cardinal virtue, which means it's a head virtue. And other virtues fall underneath that, right? Primarily we're looking at control, not only of your mind, your will, but also of your lower appetites, which is where the sexual realm would fall under, right? It's kind of the same. We talk about our base desires. Has anyone ever heard base desires? What are base desires?
Hunger or food.
Yeah, a drive towards food, right? To nourishment, water. We need that, right? Breath, air. We need air, right? As living beings, we need air. Was that air?
Chocolate.
Well, yeah, that's sure, right. And also, was that
Reproduction.
procreation, right? Reproduction. We're driven. Any living thing is driven towards those things, right? That's what's common for every living creature. We all need air. We all need nourishment. We all need to reproduce, right? Or else the species dies. That's what we call base, because that's base. That's the same for everything, right? Now, what differentiates us between other living things as human beings is we're given the gift of intellect and will, right? So let's, for instance, a dog is driven to those things by instinct, right? And so it's important to recognize those are good things. To eat, to have nourishment, to breathe, to reproduce are goods. They're very good things. They are gifts from God, right? Animals are driven towards that through their own instincts. There's not like a deliberation process with an animal, right? They see food, they eat it, right? If there's another creature there that's ready to go, they're going to do that, right? There's nothing that really differentiates that for them. We, though, are given this gift of intellect. We can deliberate what is the best for us and really what's best for all in that respect. We can actually go through a process of thinking, saying, okay, should I do this or not? Is this the best thing for me to do? Now, many in our society may argue, well, what's wrong with reproduction? If it's such a good thing and that brings about other things, that's a good. Yeah, we would agree with that. But because there's a sacredness that's involved with human procreation, because we're actually engaged with a soul which is immortal. That the fact that when we procreate, we don't only produce a living thing naturally, we produce something that actually is immortal. Whereas other living things do not have an immortal soul. So this bush is living. It has a soul. And the evidence of that is because it can grow, right? It can reproduce. It can do all these base things that a living thing can do. A dog has a soul, right? Which is evident by the fact that it can move and eat and procreate and blah, blah. The difference is we as human beings, because we're chosen to have a higher dignity, we have an immortal soul, which is of God. And even if you would talk to someone who would subscribe to the Darwinism theory, which I do. I think there's room for that when it comes to we understand God's role in creation, that he does this through processes. And there's room for Darwinism in Genesis and also in our understanding of the Catholic mythology of creation. Sure, of course. And when I say mythology, I don't mean untruth, I just mean beginning. Mythology means beginnings, right? That's what that comes from. So yeah, we can definitely say that there's an evolution of the human person over time. I don't think we can deny that. But also, no Darwinist can explain the fact that we actually have intellect, right? It's not just a function of our brains, of our organs. Because if that were the case, well, blue whales probably have much bigger intellect than we do. But there's something that's different from us, right? And so that's kind of our foundation. We have to understand this thing. First off, what the human person is, or what that means in our own dignity, and what it actually drives us and motivates us as a human person. It's not our base desires, it's our intellect and our will, which is different than instinct that what man has. Okay, we all understand that? Wonderful. Now we can talk about the virtue of temperance, right? So when it comes to the sexual realm, right, we still look at that as a good. And part of the differentiation between what the Catechism calls disordered acts and proper acts is the circumstance of them, right? So in other words, it's good for humans to procreate. It is. But because of the dignity of the human person, it's also good that they do that procreation with another human being in a committed monogamous relationship. Because we understand the marital act, the sexual act, is not just for pleasure. Now, it has to be pleasurable, or else somebody would do it. But that's not the main goal of the marital action. The main goal of the marital action is not even procreation. Even though that is an effect of the marital act, and there's a potential for that in every marital act, we would hope. The main effect of the marital action is a unitive bonding action between two human persons, a man and a woman. That throughout all human history anthropology, that action is the only action that actually bonds someone in a bond of love and is so powerful it actually can produce another human person. And because of that, whether you're religious or not, there's a sacredness involved to that. There's also, throughout all human history, been a ritual associated with that. Not even just a religious bond, but at least a natural ritual that we see with Adam and Eve. You see that every civilization known to man. There's always some kind of action, some kind of ritual involved in the bonding of two people, because there's recognition of this as being something different than other human interactions. And even different than an interaction between two men and two women. So are we clear on that? Is that pretty clear when we talk about the actual sexual act? Does that make sense? Are there any questions or objections to that? Yeah, appreciate the quiet.
The bonding coming from sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that bond only happens between men? Spiritual?
Yeah, so we would understand as a church that the sexual action is the highest expression of masculinity and femininity that's known to man. So in other words, in that action, a woman is fully a woman and a man is fully a man in that engagement. And that actually is the capstone or the epitome of the human relationship, right? So it's kind of maybe some people think it's an antiquated model, but this is what the church has always taught, that let's say you meet someone of the opposite sex and you form a bond with them. And it could even be physical, maybe it's attraction, right? That's how it would start for any two people, you would imagine, right? A man and a woman. I feel an attraction to this person. I may not be able to label that. Maybe it's physical, maybe it's lust, who knows? But there's something I'm attracted to in this other person, being a man that's a woman and a woman being a man. Okay, that's not where it ends though. That there's a growth in that formation, that relationship that says, okay, this person really kind of cares for me, and I care for this person. And we call that an emotional connection, right? So I have this feeling towards this person that I don't have really for anybody else. That's pretty okay. So there's something there that's kind of building on it. Then there may be like an intellectual relationship. So, okay, this person really kind of makes me better in a lot of ways, and I find I make this other person better, right? And whatever that may be. Like, I help them grow in their thoughts and their as a human being or in virtue. Okay, good. Then there's an understanding. I really want the best things for this person. This person wants the best things for me, and that's a spiritual relationship. Now, up to this point, two women and two men can want that for each other and have that bond. Sure, we would not say anything different from a religious standpoint from the Catholic Church. Like, yeah, two men and two women can experience those same things. Great. The difference would be, though, okay, I actually want this so much for this person, I want to make another one of them. And I want to do that in a committed, unifying relationship that's just exclusive to us, right? And that's where we have to say that's different than two men and two women. That can only be done by a man and a woman. Now, some people might say, well, what about adoption or IVF? And yeah, okay, but what we're talking about here, and we have to make a distinction here too, we're talking about a natural process compared to an artificial one, right? And so there's nothing wrong with artificial. Let's be very clear about that. Artificial, medical means of actually helping procreation, helping reproduction, we don't see anything necessarily wrong with that. Now, there are better, some ways are better than others. But what the issue there is that when we talk about the sexual act in society today, there seems to be a disconnect between, they want to separate the unity from procreating. So in other words, I want the baby, but not the sex. Or I want the sex and not the baby. And we as a church would say, you can't do that. When you engage in that action, there's always a unity involved. And there's always the potential for another person being created. Not to say it will. There are natural ways where that will not happen. Great. But regardless, there's always that potential for it. And that's what makes it sacred and only between a man and a woman. Because biologically speaking, two women and two men just cannot do that. They cannot produce a new human person in that action. No matter how much they try, how much they want. In many ways, it's kind of the same argument used for the male priesthood. That in many ways, like, as much as if I wanted to, if I really, really wanted to, and I had a whole desire to do this, nothing I can do can actually help me produce a baby. I cannot give birth. I don't have the parts. I don't have the understanding. I don't even have the pain threshold or the actual intellect to do that. That's something that is common for a woman that I just don't have. And even when I desire it, if I would desire it more than anything else in the world, I just can't do that. And how frustrating that would be if somebody had a real desire for that, but they couldn't have it happen. It's the same way for the priesthood, I think, when it comes to certain women. I think certain women think, I have this great desire to be a priest. A good example of that was Therese of Lisieux. In her writings, she wrote early on, like, she had a great desire to be a priest. And she was really moving towards that. And for 2 years, she was dead set on becoming a priest. And then she went to go talk to the Pope. And she talked to the mother of the order, the Carmelites. And she realized, wait a minute, I'm not designed for that. So in the same way, a man is not designed for child rearing and childbirth. Right? And praise God in many ways. That's the case, right? So in the same way, though, we have to understand when it comes to marital act, that's what it's designed for. It can only be done by those two parties. That's it. So I think that's why we can say we can definitely have compassion on people who experience these things and even maybe experience gender dysphoria, who say, well, I want to change my parts to become a woman so I can give birth. Yeah, okay, I can understand that feeling. I understand the desire, and I think it'd be very overwhelming. But even if you were to go change your parts to do that, you don't have the capacity to do it. It's just not possible. You can change your male parts into female parts. You still can't give birth. You'll never know what it's like to actually give birth to a child. And because of that, there's somewhat of a pity involved with that. I mean, that's got to feel terrible. But then
It's like
also,
an infertile.
yeah,
The same, feel the same.
right. Well, and I think that's the other thing too. We have to understand as well is what I tell married couples when they come to talk to me about getting married. One thing we discuss is what actually the good in procreation really is. And we understand that even if natural children do not come from that bond, we hope they do. But there are certain couples, as you mentioned, Ron, that they can't. So does that mean they're not living a procreative life? If that means their actions are not procreative, absolutely not. We would say they are because the potential is still there regardless. The fact that they engage in a married way, in a marital act, the potential for children is to come about. That can still happen even if you're infirm. Now, how can they express that procreation in their lives? Well, there's other ways in spiritual motherhood, in adoption, being a active in youth ministry or any other things that parishes provide for them. That's the way you express motherhood. And that's procreative because even though you may give life to natural children, there's an enlivening of the spirit of somebody that witnesses that marriage bond. That when I look on a married couple, I should be reminded of Christ and his church. And that gives me a new spirit, a rejuvenation. Because that's what the procreative act is. Yeah. Yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
I struggle sometimes with, there are obviously a lot of Catholics using contraception, and so then, that's obviously not procreative.
Right.
So then, homosexual, I feel like the Catholic Church definitely looks down on homosexual acts more than,
Yeah. And at that point, I think when we talk about hierarchies of sin, right? But in reality, they're both mortal, right? They're both if there's a willingness, a full knowledge and acting against that, that'd be mortal sin regardless. And objectively speaking, we'd say both are immoral. Objectively, right? And maybe not sinful. Sinfulness is more subjective, right? So if let's say I'm a homosexual man and I don't know any better and I find someone that I'm attracted to and we engage in that act, but I don't really know if that's wrong or not, I can't say it's sinful. I can say, though, that's morally wrong, right? Objectively, because the actions you're engaging in are not dignified, nor are they meant to their particular end. It's actually an action against reason itself, right? So we can talk about, well, is there maybe some mental issue there going on? Well, maybe that reduces the culpability, sure. But regardless, the action itself would still be wrong. Okay. So whether it be contraception or homosexual actions, we would say as a church, they're both bad, right? Now, the difference may be when it comes to scandal. And this may be why the church kind of focuses on one thing more than the other, because if you have a married couple and they're in their bedroom doing their own thing and you wouldn't know any better, well, okay, I would assume they're engaging properly and trying to fill their roles the way the church wants them to do, unless they told me otherwise.
I guess you could say the same with the homosexual.
Well, you could, but the main difference would be like, okay, if I see a woman, man, let's put it this way: if I see a woman, man, walking down the street holding hands, my assumption would be like, oh, maybe they're married.
Right.
Great. They start kissing, whatever. Oh, wonderful! What a great expression of
If
love.
they're kissing,
for them, right?
they're not married.
What's that?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Yeah. You know better than I. We may have a discussion later on with that, Ron. I don't know. But let's say if I see two women walking down the street holding hands and kissing, there's an objective difference there that I can say, oh, well, I don't know if that's really that great, right? Because that brings scandal to somebody. Well, it was more the assumption you're making, right? I think someone right-reasoned, if someone seen two people walking the street, if a man and woman walk the street, the charitable assumption would be, oh, they must be married. What a wonderful thing. They may not be, right? They may be engaging in some other actions that are wrong. I don't know, though, if they're just walking down the street. If I see two men and two women walking down the street holding hands and kissing, well, that's a different assumption I would make. Now, with charitable assumption I make, maybe there's really, really good friends. Am I maybe in a Middle Eastern country where like kissing like that is somewhat that's actually could be something that's socially acceptable? Okay, but walking down here on Nottingham, I don't know if I would make that assumption, right? Right? So that may be the difference here is like, okay, what would bring is there a higher level of scandal involved that's observable, right? It's actually observable. It's actually observable, right? And that would be probably the main difference.
So what if said women are married and maybe they've already adopted a child and have a family unit?
But what I'm saying is, either way, there's more of a scandal involved with that, right? Because objectively speaking, you're observing something that is actually not in line with the actual end that's meant to do.
So that would be like the same as a married couple, like handing out contraception. after
Right.
church.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. If you had a couple that are handing out condoms, like, what are you doing? Right. And I probably would have now if it's the question is, okay, what is my responsibility in there? Right. I don't think I would go up to this two women or two men walking on the street like, hey, stop doing that. What are you doing? Cut it out. Because I don't know exactly where they are. Now, maybe I might engage in a conversation like, oh, what's your names? Where are you from? What are you up to? What's going on? Maybe try to engage them in a way that's more pastoral. Doesn't mean I have to condemn them or, bring shame upon them, but I at least maybe get to know them.
Well, and does it really, like, I guess, I don't know where the church draws the line, like, in terms of, if they're holding hands and hugging, kissing in there, is that?
Interesting you would say that.
You would?
Interesting you would say that because where this is kind of covered in the Summa. So you guys know what the Summa is? Summa Theologia. So the Summa Theologia was written by Thomas Aquinas. It's just huge tome, 4 volumes. It probably has more theology than you ever really want to know or could ever know. And even that's just kind of scratching the surface of what the church teaches. It's actually kind of a side story about this. Thomas, and probably some of you guys have heard this before. At the end of his life, Thomas, he lived to be about 41 years old, which is my age right now, so I don't know what that means. But he at the end of his life, he was praying in front of the crucifix. And he had the tome, the book right next to his chair. And all of a sudden he started screaming out, it's all straw, it's all straw. And he threw the Summa into the fireplace. And his brother Dominicans ran in, they rescued the book, they had to restrain him. And what he kind of came to an understanding there is that everything he did compared to the infinite wisdom of God was nothing. So that puts in perspective because a lot of our understanding comes from Thomas of Catholic theology today. So he addresses this in question 156 and wait, hold on now. Is that right? No, 151 and 152 when he talks about lust. And so he also gets into certain aspects, especially in question 152, talking about virginity. But we'll go look at 151, the virtue of chastity. So he actually addresses this question about, well, what about hugging and kissing and whatever, right? And really, his whole conclusion comes down to, well, in general, those are not, they're relatively neutral. The vicefulness of it, for lack of a better word, comes from the intention, right? So if I'm holding hands and kissing, hugging with a lustful, intent, that would be wrong because that could lead to something worse, right? But if I'm holding hands with another person in a very chaste way without that kind of that intention, that could be considered fine, right? So that's regardless of whether it's a homosexual or heterosexual couple. It's just kind of what's the intention? So yeah, it has to be somewhat of a distinction. Thomas, though, goes into a lot of discussion in this section of the Summa. He does address like these kind of what he asks is like, is there kind of like a hierarchy involved with kind of these things like incest and bestiality and homosexuality? Kind of those are 3. And what he would argue was like the reason we just said is it depends on the level of scandal involved. And so there could be a hierarchy involved. They'll still could be considered mortal because if there's full knowledge and full consent of the will, mortal regardless, and you're still cut off from God. But there could be a level of scandal involved with those that are more public, depending on what the circumstances may be. Right. So so I think a lot of people might like bring up these arguments like, what about heterosexual couples who are living outside? And here's the thing, we would say, yeah, that's wrong still. Right? I'm not saying it's good for them to do that. And you may honestly say, well, then why don't we pay more attention to them? It's like, well, I think just because in that respect, when I have couples come in and I meet with them, they're saying they're living together. I tell them very upfront, I say, I'm going to assume you're living chastely. There may be reasons why you're living together. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's medical problems or bills. I don't know, but there are reasons that you can be. But I'm assuming, unless you tell me otherwise, that you're trying to live a chaste life, meaning maybe you have separate beds or separate rooms, or maybe you're sleeping on the couch. And if you need to, we have room here in the rectory, right? That's always open. And also, you always have the sacrament of confession available to you, right? Whether you're homosexual or heterosexual, that's always open. But the point is, the idea, though, is once you try to understand this is a time of discernment and chastity. Because if you can't practice chastity now when you're not married, there's no guarantee you're going to practice when you are married. So chastity, again, this is a virtue, right? It's directed towards self-control of the sexual appetite. Now, that takes different forms depending on your state of life, right? So we talk about celibacy. The actual definition of celibacy is just one who's not married, right? So right now, so I would assume the only celibate person right now here is, well, okay, fine, okay. So there's me for sure, you can tell for sure, right? All right. So I live a celibate lifestyle. I've taken a vow not to take a human wife. Now, in many ways, I am married. I'm married to the church. That is my bride, right? That when I'm in the person of Christ at certain moments, I'm standing as the bridegroom, and my bride is the church. And I am called to be faithful and devoted to her, right? Which means even disordered actions in my life, whether it be by myself or with another person, are disordered. I'm still called to that chaste life and called that faithfulness, that monogamy in a way, with the church. It just so happens that my church doesn't have a human physical body that I can actually go to bed with it. And so, but regardless, I'm still called to that. I try. I think we all try to do that the best we can. But there's also kind of temptations of all that too. One thing as a celibate man I have to be very aware of is, okay, am I getting too close to a person I'm actually providing service for? Whether it be in spiritual direction or pastoral guidance or any part of my ministry, do I see myself really trying to look forward to meeting with this person, actually maybe go my way trying to meet with this person? And if I am, that's something I need to actually put in check and even try to find someone else to help them, because obviously I'm not the person for that. And a lot of that's on me to make sure of that, because that's part of my priestly vow is celibacy. I've dedicated my life to something else other than another person. And so whether it be an emotional, whether it be a physical, cheating is cheating. It still falls under the realm of adultery. And I need to be on guard against that as a celibate man. Right? So that's what celibacy is. Now we talk about continence and incontinence. Yeah, sorry, Elise.
Before you go on.
Yeah.
So isn't that painting a very broad picture of relationships? Because you talked about like spiritual connection, intellectual connection. You can have those. You can't be too close to a person if it's intellectually.
Yeah, but
right?
what I'm talking about is they have to be in the proper context and circumstance, right? So for instance, let's say I have a 24-year-old woman fresh out of college who comes to me for spiritual direction, right? She says, "Father, I need help. Can you use?" I'm like, "Sure. Let's meet, whatever." And then, over the course of time, maybe a few months, I start to develop a bond with this person, right? And so far healthy, as a father providing, spiritual direction for my spiritual daughter. But then I start realizing, like, maybe I should call her and maybe set up another appointment, right? Maybe ask her about dinner sometime. That'd be kind of fun, whatever it is. We have a good relationship going on right now. Then that's just completely improper.
Even if it's a friendship.
Yeah, but see the tension there, right? Because
What if there's no intention?
well, but that's what I'm saying. In this case, there is.
Okay.
Right. So
Cross the line.
it crossed the line. I've come to level of propriety that's not proper for the relationship that we have, the boundary that we have to establish. Right. So that's to say I can't have female friends.
It's like avoiding the near occasion of sex.
Exactly. Right. That's not to say I would say that many women here are my friends, and I'm happy to have hang out and do things with you. Great. Right. But that's in a chaste way. But also, even in that respect, if I try to change that boundary to something isn't appropriate, that's a problem for them and for me. And the difference is I'm the one that sets that boundary, right? So it's the intention really that matters in that respect. Yeah.
Okay, we have many, many priest friends we're very close to. They're like family to
Yeah.
us. We love them dearly.
Right.
And one of my priest friends said he couldn't be my spiritual director because we're too
Yeah.
close.
That's
And
yes.
so therefore, yeah, that's
Yeah.
a great way to put it.
Right.
Make that another separate
Right.
and keep the friendship
Exactly.
clear.
I will just put it this way. I am not friends with any of my directees.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. I make it very clear in my directees, I will never contact you. The ball's in your court as far as setting up meetings. You're not going to hear from me otherwise. Don't ask me about dinner. Don't ask me to hang out and go to the baseball game. It ain't going to happen.
Yeah, because it changes. the
Exactly.
relationship.
Right.
Mm.
And so that's what I'm saying. If I start seeing myself like, well, maybe I can do that. That should be a big red flag.
I guess it would be like someone being friends with like a therapist.
Yeah,
or something
yeah,
like that,
Yeah, in
right?
some ways, that's right. Yeah. But yeah, but that boundary is really what may be the distinction in that, right? So again, it's not that I shouldn't have female friends. I should have female friends. Every man should have female friends. But what we have to check though is this going past the boundary that's already been established? And that's really the key. So that's why even two men or two women, yeah, you can have that boundary and that established that friendship. Great. But when you start going into that realm of the expression of the sexual act, well, that's actually against reason and your own dignity, and we can't uphold that as being a good, or at least not of a high good. Let's put it that way.
That is really challenging though, because I think, like in a lot of relationships or marriages, I think sometimes your partner, you might have more of a spiritual connection with someone else, or you know what I mean? You can't
Yeah.
just one human to
Yeah.
meet all your needs.
Yeah.
So I think.
Well, and that even brings me to your point too. Like, well, so could it be sinful even within a marriage to engage in a sexual act? Well, yeah. Right. I mean, it could. Because again, it comes down to your intention. If are you approaching your wife, your husband, in an act of love, or an act of lust? Because you can still have lust within a marriage, right? That's true. But that doesn't mean that the act you're engaging in is an act of love. Again, it comes down to the intention. What are you intending here? That's the thing. I can't really answer that for anybody. I mean, when people come in the confessional, it's funny. I get a lot of. I always love the question, Father, is that a mortal sin? I was like, well, I can tell you it's immoral. Whether it's a mortal sin or not, only you know. Because I don't know what you know, and I don't know if you did it contrary to what you know. That's the definition of mortal sin. Only the person who can tell me that is you. If you're confessing, I'm assuming it is. I can tell you if I did it, it would be. Because I know it would be. I would do it anyway. But I can't say the same for anyone else. I can tell you objectively it's immoral based on divine law, natural law. Sure. But I can't tell if it's mortal sin.
But you just said that contraception and homosexuality was a mortal sin.
They're grave matter.
Okay.
Definitely grave matter. And they would be immoral. But whether it's mortal sin or not depends on the subjects that are doing it. So that's why, like,
That they know it or they believe it.
well, they have to understand it, and then they do it anyway. So in other words, if let's say
abortion's okay if you still have one, that you're still,
Well,
if you know it.
right, exactly. So that's what I'm saying. Like, that's why it's difficult sometimes when people ask that question, because I can say it's grave matter based on what we understand as church. Now, whether you knew that or not, and whether you knew that and did it anyway, I can't tell you that. That's when we understand the subject of conscience, right? The church tries to inform the conscience, but it's up to the individual to actually receive it. Which why it makes kind of like when you look at let's say weddings or funerals, when people come for communion, what I say in that time right before communion is, the Eucharist is reserved for baptized Christians who believe what the church believes about the Eucharist, namely it's the body, blood, soul, and divinity, consecrated at the hands of a validly ordained priest, and that someone's in a state of grace. Those are the requirements to receive communion, the Eucharist in the Catholic Church. Now, what I say is, if you don't understand what any of that means, then you shouldn't come up, right? You can come and receive a blessing, but if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you receive a blessing or just stay in your pew. Otherwise, if you meet those requirements, you're free to engage in the sacrament. Because state of grace is also subjective too. Like when we talk with the RCA candidates when they come in, when I have a meeting with them, that comes up inevitably. Can I receive communion? And I ask them, well, you're baptized, right? Yeah. Do you believe we believe about the church? Well, yeah. Are you in a state of grace? Well, I think so. Well, what do you think that means? Have you committed a mortal sin? I don't know what that is. See, the reason, so that could actually mean they are in a state of grace, right? So I mean, it's a very interesting discussion. What I typically tell them is, you probably just want to wait until Easter, the vigil, just because it's more special time. But some of that could be. I had someone this past year who was getting married, and we had the conversation, and he received his first confession before his marriage, and he received communion at his wedding. Wonderful, right? But there's still to be that understanding of what that means, those words mean. So it gets kind of in the weeds sometimes, a lot of these things. And that's why it's always very particular. That's the circumstances people find themselves in for these things. Does that help? Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so continence and continence. Basically, continence and continence means, do I engage in the marital act or not? So continence is usually looked on within the marriage bond, right? So in other words, the church understands that even within the marriage bond, of course, a celibate person, someone outside the marriage bond, is incontinent, meaning they should not engage in that act, right? But people that are in the marriage bond have a choice in many ways, right? So what the church says is that sometimes you may find yourself in a circumstance where you can't engage in the act. And you're called to practice that chastity within the marriage, right? So maybe there's a medical issue, right? Maybe you just had a baby and you need some time to heal, right? Those are times for chastity. Those are times for continence, right? That's self-control in those respects, right? Within that bond. What's kind of interesting is there's a big debate right now about permanent deacons. So in the Eastern churches, we understand that priests are married. There are priests that be married before they're ordained. That's something that happens. But in the Eastern Church, those priests are called to maintain a level of continence especially before the divine worship. Now, in the Eastern rites, they typically celebrate only on Sundays. So you won't see like a daily mass at like a Byzantine church. They only have it on Sunday. So what they typically require for their priests is 24 hours of abstinence, right, of continence before they actually celebrate the divine worship. Now, we have married priests in the Latin Rite. So you would think that the same thing would pertain to them. Well, the problem there, though, is in Latin Rite, we celebrate Mass every day. So is there a dispensation for that? How does that work? I don't know. Father Rainier, I know, had a baby, but it's before after he was ordained, so I don't even get involved with that.
Father Lockwood had 5.
See, so I mean, there's an understanding there about what that means maybe for each person, right? Before he got ordained.
Before he was moved into the church.
Okay, all right, okay. Yeah, and so in that way, that's probably okay. But but the question there, like, well, permanent deacons, right? Well, they could serve at the Mass every day if they wanted to. Not everyone does, so maybe that's where it lies. I don't know. But a lot of that just depends on the circumstance of what's being dictated, what dispensations are given. Because the clergy are called to that abstinence, to that continence. And abstinence is really, again, just this kind of a broader term for just kind of self-mastery, control. That actually spreads more into not just the sexual appetite, but also the guttural appetite too, right? Yeah. So you could use that term more broadly. But continence is something that you're called for to do as a clergy before you actually celebrate and worship. Now, I don't know, some celibate, I don't know what that is for. I don't know.
The deacons aren't celebrating, so why would that?
Well, yeah, but they're still ministering in a official clerical way, right? And
that
so
would apply to a lecture in the proper sense.
no, because the difference is they haven't received orders. It's actually the grace of the sacrament, the capacity for the sacrament, right? So a lay minister is different than a clergy in that respect.
But there are orders of lectures.
There are, but those are lay orders. You're not actually,
in
you're not
the
receiving,
seminary?
you're not receiving holy orders in that respect.
Even in the seminary.
Even in the seminary. Yeah. Holy order starts with the diaconate. Now you could practice continence as a lay minister if you want to. I mean, that'd be a nice sacrifice to give for the Lord before you minister. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but there's no edict or no explicit teaching of the church says you should need to have to. But there's a big question for permanent deacons, right? So like, should they? Do they? I don't know. Do they even know? I mean, it is kind of an open question, I think.
So deacons, if they aren't married before they're ordained, have to take a vow of celibacy.
Correct. And deacons who are married, once their wife dies, they've also cannot remarry.
Well, we do have abstinence for an hour before mass.
True.
Before we receive the Holy
Maybe the same thing for confidence. Maybe that's what it is. That may be it. You know, maybe you got it. That could be. I don't really know enough because I mean I'm not a permanent deacon. It was pretty clear for me what my role was, what my obligations were.
Okay, question
So,
for Deacon Dave.
Yeah, it could be. I don't know.
Deacon Dave, we have a theological
I don't know.
question.
I don't know. I don't know if you would. I honestly don't know if you would know
Are you
either.
ritually clean today?
Yeah, right. Yeah. How do we check that?
Why- Wouldn't that be something they would study? So that they would know the rule?
Barb, they should. They should. Now we're starting to talk about formation and how maybe the lack thereof that kind of happens between certain levels of the orders. I don't know. I know there's always been a question about the diaconate formation, about are they really under, maybe drive that point home. When I was in master of ceremony, we had the permanent diaconate ordination that year. It only happens every 2 years for the permanent deacons, right? And the MC had to make a point that the deacons are not giving first blessings after the ordination. And that came to a big shock to a lot of the deacons because they thought, well, wait a minute, I thought I could give. Well, no, the book of blessings does not allow for deacons to give blessings of people. Deacons can bless things. They can, the only exception would be witnessing marriages.
Ever?
The book of blessings is pretty clear about that. It makes distinction between what does a priest do, what does a deacon do, and what does a layperson do.
And I thought they could baptize.
They can baptize, yeah, of course.
Okay, but that's blessing.
But that's
a person.
sacramental. That's a sacramental nature, right? They're actually they're ministering of the sacrament in that respect.
Okay,
Right, but like if you can, let's say you want Deacon Dave is like, Deacon, can you give me a blessing? It depends. Like, even that kind of depends. Even that kind of depends on what kind of aspect that would be, right? So, like, in what capacity are you asking me, right?
so when he's giving communion and he gives a blessing, okay.
There's even a question about that.
Oh, good Lord.
So the question there is even for priests, actually. There's a question. There's what we call a lacuna, right? A question in the liturgy about, is that adding to the liturgy? That even if a priest gives a blessing in the communion line, is that adding? Because it doesn't say in the rubric anywhere that's actually allowed, or in the juror.
Well, it doesn't say that the prayer. It doesn't say that the prayer.
Yes, Aaron, you're right. I do, but here's the thing: if the Swiss Guard would come take me to prison, I'll go willingly. That's fine. One of the things is, that's one of the big jokes about the church. Well, jokes. That's one of the things about the church is there's no like liturgy police are going to come in and arrest you if you do something wrong, right? But there is but the other thing is an open question. So it's not to say you can't, it's just that, well, we don't really know if you should.
Yeah.
Right? So should you err on the side of caution and say, well, I'm not going to? Or because it's become such like kind of a standard now especially in North America, it'd be kind of weird if you just stopped. And that may cause other issues. I mean, I know people that will.
Use the wedding example earlier and say, like, if you're not going to receive someone
Right.
blessing.
Right.
It only
Yeah.
became an issue.
Yeah.
And the thing is that
Well, what does that mean though, too? God bless you.
There's a spiritual communion prayer that I do when I can't receive.
Right.
I say that
Yeah.
all the time, because if I don't have time, I'm singing the mass or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
I do the spiritual, I do the spiritual communion prayer.
And I know there's like families, their kids will stand there until I make a motion.
They won't move.
They will not move.
and,
It's like, all right.
there's something, the Catholic Church does teach that we are a church of tradition,
Yes.
as well as a church of specified rules.
Right.
So this has become even though it may not have started properly, it's become a tradition.
Well, what you're talking about is what we call moss, right?
A local tradition.
Well, yeah. Canon law talks about local tradition, moss, and the requirements for that is it has to be at least 35 years with the bishop's knowledge.
Well, the bishop knows.
Does he?
Oh, come on.
I don't know.
The bishop
I don't know.
knows.
I mean, we just got a new bishop. Is I'm not sure. Right? I mean,
Like
we're-
political
how has it been?
plausibility.
I don't know. No. Yeah, your point is valid. You're right. And so it's like that's the thing. To that point, though, yeah. Maybe at this point, it's like, well, maybe it is false. I don't know. Probably. But that's still kind of an open question in liturgy. Am I adding to that? It's like now with the new rite of what goes back to like we're talking about. There's a new rite for wedding ceremonies came out in 2016, and it just so happened our class was going through that class when we were talking. The new rite came out, and one of the things it was said explicitly is there no additions to the liturgy. And the examples used were like, well, unity candles and the sand. Now they do like glass or something where they kind of combine glass and no alcohol. So that's all verboten. That's all like no whatever. So the question came up though is like, well, what about like bringing flowers to Mary? And the response I got is like, well, there's a theological aspect of that, but is it actually added to liturgy? Technically, it is. So what do you do?
You could try to tell us the time on the hill, not to bring flowers.
Here's what and Matt, I tell couples, I'm like, look, I'm okay for I'm not gonna go ahead. I'm not gonna say anything. I don't,
Make an offer.
well, maybe look at that next time. I don't know. But yeah, but I mean, it's one of these things where it's like there's all these kind of aspects of it. It's like okay.
That's not really part of the liturgy, though, is it? It's just
No, it's not.
I mean, no, I mean, the action of doing that wouldn't make it a part of the liturgy. It's just
Unless it's
personal,
outside of the beginning of Mass or the
Correct.
final
Yeah.
blessing.
So after the final
personal
blessing, if they want to do that. Okay.
So
it's a
that's
personal
why we
fine.
do the prayer of St. Michael after the blessing,
You can make that argument.
because
Maybe
otherwise
it's
it would be changing the liturgy.
To that point too, this just came out too. They're changing the wording for absolution. The essential rite's the same, but there's certain words that are changing, which is going to be great for priests. I mean, I've only ordained 3 years, and I haven't memorized, and I was like, oh great. So it's only 2 words, but still it's going to be either way. As long as the priest says, I absolve you from all your sins, from your sins, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you're absolved. So that's all you have to worry about. But yeah, regardless. But I digress. So I think that's kind of a better understanding of these different aspects we understand under temperance. And so it's important to recognize that when we talk about this, what the purpose of marital act is. And so again, it's not that we can't have compassion and love for people's experiences. We should, right? But we also can't condone these actions that are obviously against reason and against human dignity. And so with that respect, I would always charitably assume if I see 2 men or 2 women, I'm going to assume they're good friends and maybe they're trying to live a chaste life. That's really probably the best assumption you can make. Unless there's some kind of action going on right in front of me that really, say otherwise, I would make that assumption. And that's probably the best thing we can do, right? But also, I think it's good to engage. And just, I mean, we understand when we talk about evangelizations, we meet people where they are to get them to where God wants them to be, right? And so that's not to say we can't challenge, right? But I think we have to do that in love too.
I think
And part of that establishing a relationship first, before we actually do that.
the church needs to hold up people that are living that
Right.
lifestyle. Like I know couples that are in an irregular marriage,
Right.
but they practice chastity.
Yeah.
And nobody would know that.
Right.
Or homosexual couples that are practicing chastity. They're devout
Right.
Catholics.
Right.
So the church should hold those people up as
Yes,
models
I agree. 100%.
instead of trying to condemn.
Which
I mean, we still have to.
yeah, and that's
draw
why
the
if you go
line,
to
but-
the Courage or Encourage websites, there are hundreds of stories like that too. And you see people who are maybe engaged in the same-sex lifestyle, and they realize the truths of the faith, and they convert. And they're some of the biggest champions of these things. And so I think it's important to recognize that there's the ministry for these people too. And we're called to minister as well. Not condemn, not browbeat, not beat over the head with this is what Jesus says you should do it this way. It's meeting people where they are, loving them in the midst of it, and then also bringing them the truth. That's what Jesus does. That's what we're called to do too.
Yeah, 'cause I always feel like this topic in particular is like a casting of the first stone.
Oh, yeah.
kind of thing, you know,
Yeah,
and
sure.
like when you think about other sins like gossiping and things like those seem like such a bigger separation from God than sexual. I don't know. I feel like when you're younger and you grow up in the
Yeah.
church, it seems like the sexual sins are like the biggest, baddest. You know.
Well,
worst thing.
and to that end, Thomas actually argues that really these sins of the flesh, like gluttony, lust, they're actually the lowest of the sins, right? He would actually say that the sins of the body are actually much easier to overcome because there's actually a more of a physical reaction to it. Like if you eat too much food, you're going to feel sick, and you know you've ate too much food, right? That's much easier to overcome than maybe more of what we call a spiritual sin, like pride, right, or envy. Because one of the problems with pride is you don't often know that you're actually exhibiting pride.
Right.
Because that's one of the nature of pride is that it tries to block you from that understanding. And so Thomas makes that kind of argument, right? So yeah, I think there's something to that. There's truth to that too. Right? So you and Thomas are on the same page.
He's a reason.
So-
She lays
Tell
awake
to be
at
on the
night.
same page.
he really is. That's pretty true.
One on several years.
So yeah, I think so. If you want to look on your own, questions 141 through 170 are basically dealing with temperance with this issue. Thomas has a lot to say about all these things, and if you ever read the Summa, like for instance, I can just read real quick, maybe one of these from let's say let's go with the chassis. So the question here is it a virtue distinct from abstinence? So we're talking about abstinence when it comes to charity. So the way he puts it out here is that these objections, right, that actually would hold that it would be distinct, or may not be distinct. Then he actually has he says on the contrary, and usually quotes either Paul or he calls the philosopher who is Aristotle. Then he gives his own perspective on it. Then he replies to the objections. So in this case, for Article 3, this is question 142, right? 151, sorry. Whether chastity is a distinct virtue from abstinence. So it would seem that chastity is not a distinct virtue from abstinence because where the matter, so matter is just like the stuff, right, is generally the same, one virtue suffices. Now it would seem that things pertaining to the same sense are of the one genus, so genus species, right? Therefore, since pleasures of the palate, which are the matter of abstinence, and venereal pleasure, which are the matter of chastity, pertain to the touch, it seems that chastity is not a distinct virtue from abstinence. So he's basically arguing there is that they are different. Okay. Objection 2. The philosopher, Aristotle, likens all vice and temperance to childish sins, which he chastising. Now, chastity takes its name from chastisement of the contrary vices. Since then, certain vices are bridled by abstinence, it seems that abstinence is chastity. Okay. So now he's making an argument that maybe, right? Further, the pleasures of the other senses are the concerns of temperance, insofar as they refer to pleasures of touch, which are the matter of temperance. Now, pleasures of the palate, which are the matter of abstinence, are directed to venereal pleasures, which are the matter of chastity. Wherefore, Jerome says, commenting on Titus, not given to wine, no striker, etc., the belly and the organs of the generation are neighbors, and that neighborhood of the organs may indicate their complicity in vice. Therefore, abstinence and chastity are not distinct virtues. So basically, all below the belt, it's all kind of the same thing, right? Right.
Death by association.
Here's the thing. He actually, when you read a lot of Thomas, he actually is kind of funny in a lot of things.
Yeah.
Right? So on the contrary, the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians reckons chastity together with fastings, which pertain to abstinence. I answer that, as stated above in second part, 141. Temperance is properly about the concupiscences of the pleasures of touch. Concupiscences, we know what that is. What is it called?
It's not a willingness, it's sinning over and over.
Yeah, so it's actually the temporal effects of the fall, right? So concupiscence is why are we always tempted? Well, because it's the effect of the fall of Adam and Eve, which is concupiscence, right? That's the So that where there are different kinds of pleasure, there are different virtues compromised under temperance. Now, pleasures are proportionate to the actions whose perfections they are, as stated in Ethics, such as another Aristotle. And it's evident that actions connected with the use of food, whereby the nature of the individual is maintained, differ generically from actions connected with the use of matters venereal, whereby the nature of the species is preserved. Therefore, chastity, which is about venereal pleasures, is a distinct virtue from abstinence, which is about pleasures of the palate. So even then, he's saying abstinence is more food, right? Not venereal, it's actually just food, right? Now, we use it kind of interchangeably, but Thomas makes that distinction, okay? Then his reply, so reply to the first objection, temperance is chiefly about pleasures of touch, not as regards to the sense of judgment concerning the objects of touch, which judgment is of uniform character concerning all such objects, but as regards the use itself of those objects, stated in Ethics. Now, the use of meats, drinks, and venereal matters differ in character. Wherefore, there must be to be different virtues, though they regard the one sense. So he's kind of going back and reiterating the objections against these. That's how he does all these things, right? And he does that for every different topic. So part one is really about the Trinity. It's really about, you know, what God is. Then he goes to the different persons. Part two is broken up into two separate parts, and he kind of goes through the virtues and the vices. And then finally, part three, the reason he's called the angelic doctor is because he goes in more aspects of what angels are in part three. So it's actually he also covers like salvation history in part three, the roles of the saints. So there's a lot of stuff in the Summa. And if you have about 15 years, it's probably good to read it and just digest it. So I will tell you, in our seminary formation, we do read the Summa pretty much every class we have, and we never got through it.
Yeah. Oh wow.
So just to let you know that.
I know people that started in college that in their 40s just finished a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
The same group.
Well, just that one alone, that whole question could probably take you a day just to contemplate and understand through it.
Yeah.
If you didn't have the philosophical background, especially, trying to get these definitions of these terms, it takes a while. So
There's not like a summary version in like modern
There's
English.
No.
some
They're like a
actual-
Cliff
some
Note
people-
version.
some
There's
people-
study guides.
Yeah, some people kind of write like
There
kind
is
of more
translation.
like summaries and stuff. There are, but the problem with that is
Maybe
you're
they
looking at
translated it
interpretation of
wrong or-
interpretation.
yeah.
The Latin.
Right, and so you're really it's probably best. I always like to do it with the source material.
Yeah.
But then again, I've also studied what these terms mean and stuff, so it's like a little bit easier for me to actually, okay, that's what he's
And
talking
studying
about.
the great philosophers helped
Studying
me
Aristotle
a lot
helped actually
before-
studying this.
before I
Right.
read. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
then when I
if,
really fail, I just look at St. Augustine.
yeah, if you really want to do it right,
No.
if you want to actually like interpret this correctly, read Aristotle first.
Yes.
Nicomachean Ethics,
Yeah.
and then read the writings of maybe De Trinitate, as well as any writings by Augustine, and then read this.
Yeah.
So now instead of 15 years
So
looking
now-
at
Yeah,
15
really
years,
right.
right? So yeah,
Like I said, Lisa, I
Right.
take Thomas Aquinas in little doses.
Yeah.
Because mostly he's above my pay grade.
most people he is.
So
Yeah.
And the little doses to get ID,
Right,
but he's really
Yep.
difficult.
Yeah, and in some ways he's more succinct though, like John Paul II. If you ever read anything by John Paul II, John Paul II has beautiful language, but it takes a while to actually figure out what he's actually trying to say. Because sometimes you have to take whole paragraphs and condense into one sentence. Oh, here's what he means. It's wonderful. It's beautiful stuff. But if you ever read Theology of the Body, we're actually reading that now with RLA. I'm actually going through each session, and yeah, I have to kind of break it down because what he writes is there's a lot of philosophy. And if you don't have a background in those terms and those premises, you're kind of treading through the weeds.
Well, and
And
it's
same thing
written
with
in Latin.
Thomas.
And especially when they
Well,
reference it.
You talking about with John Paul II, or
Yeah.
well, yeah, but the translations are pretty good for him in English. They're pretty decent. Probably better than most things that are translated from Latin and English. So, yeah. But yeah, no. If you read Theology about English, you probably get a pretty good understanding of it, though.
Like a running joke in our house, my copy where you can see where I've stopped, where I've dog eared like 10 different
Yeah.
pages, all within like the same chapter.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, because Theology of the Body there's basically his Wednesday audiences from I think it's August of 1979 all the way through like April of 1984. So they basically just put his audiences, his Wednesday audiences, written them down, and then that's what theology of the body is. And it really is. It's really about. It really comes from Genesis. It's really kind of a reflection on Genesis and what the purpose of human beings are. It's beautiful. Like I said, it's beautiful. A lot of philosophy. It's very deep. In the same way, though, it takes some time to interpret.
So going back to Pride Month.
Yeah.
How does a Catholic respond to these issues in, I guess, pluralistic society, or
Yeah.
a society that doesn't completely embrace,
Yeah.
our tradition anymore.
Right.
And what's the role of Catholics in politics and policy, and
Yeah.
should we get involved? I mean, I don't want to open up a whole
Yeah.
other topic,
No, I think it's important. I mean, so I think the way that we approach this from a Catholic perspective, especially so again, we're not called to go to the parades. We're not called to engage in that lifestyle in any way. But I think we are called to engage in a personal way. So it's not necessarily like you have to making Twitter statements and Facebook comments and whatever else. That's not helpful. It's the face-to-face interaction, right? If you know somebody, or I think it's a time when you know someone that's experiencing their correction, or is going through, dysmorphia in some way, to engage with them, because you are the face of Christ, right? I think to show that. I always say when it comes to evangelization, it's always a better way to live authentically than actually preach authentically. So when you're engaging with people on a level way, trying to get to know them on a personal level, and then showing them the love of Jesus through that, you make much better inroads than putting a tweet out or a Facebook post or whatever. So I think from a personal standpoint, that's how we can actually engage and help people grow.
I know so many parents struggle,
Yeah.
with their kids.
Oh, yeah.
Or their kids are having a wedding and they not go.
Right.
Yeah,
and I typically advise parents when it comes to like those situations, like especially if it's like a daughter or son, go, because here's the thing, you can still go and love them and not condone it. That's true. Now, a priest or sister, or someone that's ordained, not going to be there. And I mean, I've had this from personal experience too. I've had not in this particular realm, but I've had cousins who got married outside the church, and they invited me. I said I can't. Yeah, I mean, I can't, because of who I am. I can't. My presence there could be considered condoning. I can't do that. I wish the best for you. I don't wish anything on you, but you are, especially if
By
you were
extension,
baptized.
being a Catholic baptized,
Right.
That is also
Right.
condoning
Yeah.
in a way.
Right. But I think there's ways you can still kind of, depending on the relationship, maintain that open channel, right? By not condoning, and also not condoning it. Right.
Yeah, like I guess if you're the parent, they probably know where you stand on
Right.
it, but you can still be present.
Right.
I guess.
You could get stuck in traffic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
pretend the
yeah.
wedding was an hour
Yeah,
later,
you could do that too.
and then say, "Oh, I'll see you at the reception."
Right, yeah, you could, right. Yeah, I mean, there's ways you can actually handle, I think, that's tactful, right? And part of that's doing the best thing you can for you and the relationship you have. I usually typically fall on the side of, if you understand, as long as you understand this is not, valid, and you're not condoning it, but you're doing it, again, it comes down to the intention. Your intention is to maintain the lines of communication up with your son and daughter, by all means, fine. And maybe just sit in the back or whatever. I mean, there's ways you can kind of maybe do that. That's
And
better.
ideally, the children would understand
You would
your
imagine.
position,
Right.
and respect you, and say, "I understand if you
Yeah.
can't make it, but we'll see you at the reception."
And I think sometimes, though, maybe in that respect too, sometimes it's almost sort of a I dare you situation too sometimes, right? And so I think in that respect as well, you still have to be respectful, but also maintain that relationship. Something like that.
I just think it's a bigger problem in society that people feel like they have to draw a line in the sand.
Right.
There's no, it's an utter lack of temperance
Yeah.
and moderation.
Yeah, I think there's also mentality. My dad said this: "Love me, love my dog." Right? Yeah, right. Yeah. So I mean, it's like one of these things where, you don't love this aspect of me, you don't love all of me, and that's so untrue, right? But I think a lot of people think it's an all or nothing attitude. And so I think part of that is, okay, well, can we engage in a way that's still loving and respectful and also show that we don't necessarily condone these actions? I think there's ways we can do that. Now, the other question about, well, politically, how do politicians? Well, I think the same way the catechism say the same thing when it comes to things like abortion. That the responsibility of a Catholic politician is to not enlarge it any further, and at minimum, just say nothing. Right. I think that's what I mean.
But
That's
I
one thing.
talk to Catholics that are devout, I guess, that are upset that the Supreme Court's going to overturn Roe v. Wade because they think, well, there's people that aren't Catholic and they should have a right to decide what they want to do. And I'm thinking,
well,
it's still a child.
Well, and so I think, and here's the thing. I think the other aspect this kind of goes along with people who experience rejection is we have to understand also too, what does compassion really mean? Right? Compassion is not just being. I kind of felt this in some way, and I think it's very true. We're not called to be nice. Right? Niceness is not a virtue. Niceness oftentimes actually goes against reason and truth. Now we're called to be kind, right? And there's a difference between being kind and being nice. There's a difference between being compassionate and have a pseudo compassion, right? So in other words, okay, you have a feeling. I sympathize with you in that feeling. I understand that you feel unjust or maybe you're scared about certain aspects of this or whatever. But also, we have to understand there's a higher truth involved here. And whether it's with LGBTQIA or whether it's the issue of abortion or whether it be euthanasia or whether it be immigration or whatever else, we're always called to uphold human life and the dignity of the human person. And anything that goes against that is not only not compassionate, it's not kind, it's not truthful.
We are called to be a part of our spiritual, our work, corporal and spiritual works of mercy. We are called in kindness and to see the face of Christ in folks and still hold up our spiritual and corporal works of mercy, the tenets of all that in our faith. And I feel like that a lot has been lost.
Yeah, I will tell you, and here's I think the problem with a lot of these things too is a lot of things is what's promoted as the narrative is really against what the stats actually show. One thing has been very eye-opening, actually very beautiful for me, is working at Rachel's Vineyard. Rachel's Vineyard for women who have had abortions and are trying to find healing. What's so fascinating is Dr. Teresa Burke wrote a book called Forbidden Grief, and in it, I mean, she talks about her experience as a therapist, but also the statistics about women who have actually had abortions. A good majority of them suffer not only mental anguish, emotional strife, depression, suicide from these actions. When society's telling them, "No, it's fine, you're good,"
Their whole lives.
it's no problem, right?
Their whole lives.
But there's something that's here to them that they just, it's hurtful and it's destructive. And the problem is they can't express it because they're told you shouldn't do that. What you did was good. You should have no remorse or regret from that. But that's untrue. And so I think in the same way, I mean, we definitely want to have compassion on people, help them heal. Now, part of that has to be received too, right? We can't force it on anybody, but we can still love them in the midst of it. So, yeah, we want to be very clear about what our role is. And I think that, sometimes it depends on the circumstances. But I think, like I said, I think living authentically is much more evangelistic than speaking authentically. So I think that's something to keep in mind too.
Something that drives people bishops to say so and so can't receive over the politicians.
Boy,
Pelosi.
I always say I pray to God. I hope you all pray as well that I've never asked to be a bishop. I don't want that job. I don't know who would want that job. You have to be insane to take that job. Sorry, that's just the truth. We always uphold the truth. And here's my tack when it comes to bishops. I wouldn't know what to do with that job. And so I can't condemn anyone for doing what they're doing. I mean, so I think last Father the Father. I don't. Was it last Father the Father? Someone had a question about. Maybe it was something
A
else.
couple ago.
Yeah, maybe it was. Because someone had a question about like what do we say about like things like Archbishop Leone compared to like Cardinal Gregory, who has not really said anything. I mean, he said some things recently about it, but he's not going to the extent of Archbishop Leone to say you're under interdict, and that's basically what Archbishop Leone did. Said and, the Speaker of the House under interdict, meaning there's certain aspects of the faith that she cannot actually engage in until she rectifies the situation. And that's all a bishop really does is just basically declare what reality actually is.
It's pretty clear.
Well, all he's really doing is making explicit what actually is already occurring. And so now some people may say, well, why isn't Gregory doing that? Well, my charitable interpretation of this is, well, obviously Archbishop Corleone has said he's had conversations with her, trying to make it very clear to her. There's been some movement, but she's not actually brought up her end of the bargain. And because of that, that was a line for him. He said, I have to make this statement. I don't know if Cardinal Gregory's had the same level of interaction with her. And maybe there's kind of a two-pronged approach to say, okay, we need to make it very clear, but also want to maybe keep the line of communication open for her. Because it's not about condemning her, it's about the good of her soul. And we shouldn't rejoice in the fact that someone is put under interdict or excommunicated. We should be praying for them and hope for their conversion. Right. So, yeah, it's difficult. But
that's really because of the scandal thing, right?
Right.
Publicly, like in a
well, I think from Archbishop Cardinal, that's the issue, is that he's to the point now where a lot of our so-called Catholic politicians who are upholding these principles are contrary to Catholic teaching. There needs to be something done so that this is not flourishing, because I think what and I mean, right, so I think what Archbishop Cardinal is seeing is political officials have probably much more influence than bishops at this point. They're much more prominent in society than bishops are at this point. And so if our bishops aren't saying anything about it,
they're defining Catholicism more than the bishops.
And I think that's what some of the thought, right? So I think to save scandal, to actually save the teaching of the church, I think he made that statement. I applaud him for it. I think he did it in a very pastoral, very charitable way. Now, will Cardinal Gregory follow suit? What's the line for him? I don't know.
Well, shouldn't bishops not publicly, like, if one bishop does this, shouldn't everybody kind of follow
the
line?
collegiality of the bishop.
What is the problem here?
Barb,
You can't do, yes,
Yeah.
I will, no, I won't.
I agree with you, but it's also kind of one of the unique situations when it comes to the ecclesiology of the church, is that a bishop has full autonomy within his diocese. That if Archbishop Rosansky says here in St. Louis, hey, no Catholic politicians are supporting abortion in our city communion, okay. Now, can they go across the river? Sure. Provided that Archbishop Paprocki or Bishop McGovern doesn't say anything, sure. But that just shows what the role of the bishop is. And it's funny, I think it was kind of funny. You saw a lot of the reactions from especially like people who aren't Catholic who were like making comments about, we can't do that. It's like, yeah, he can. What are you talking about? That's his job. Sure he can. It's kind of amazing to see some of the reaction. But also, I don't think it's the first time it's ever done. If you look at over in Illinois, I mean, Bishop Paprocki's made statements for Catholic politicians over there all the time. So it's not new.
A high profile.
Yeah, sure. I think we could say probably she's the most highest profile politician that has happened to her. Sure, okay.
And some people have said, well, the Pope said Biden was good to go.
Well,
but here's the thing, the bishop, the Pope is only the Bishop of Rome,
correct.
right?
So the Pope cannot lift the interdict.
Yes.
Oh.
The only person who can lift the interdict
he's
is
just
the
a Bishop of Rome. He says with those people, yeah.
Well, as far as jurisdiction,
In this
yeah.
part, as far as jurisdiction.
Now, when it comes
Right.
to faith and morals,
So
yeah,
he
he is
can't tell
infallible.
Pope
But so the extent of that though is, could the Holy Father move someone else into that position? Sure, he could, right? But regardless, even then, the bishop there would have to lift the interdict. It would have to be the bishop of the jurisdiction.
So he could remove the bishop if he didn't agree.
He could,
Yeah,
but then
he could.
also Tara, that may cause bigger issues too,
Well, yeah.
right? So I think someone in Rome probably be like, no, it's not too bad.
Yeah.
That's what the curious for.
So yeah, it's I think we got a little different topics here, but it's good.
Yeah.
It's good. Yeah.
Well, we
Yeah.
can focus on June being the month of the
Sacred Heart.
Yeah.
I think
of
it's good. Yes.
Jesus, so we'll
Yes.
consecrate all.
Right.
to
Amen.
sacred.
Amen. And maybe that's another thing to pray for. Pray for our brothers and sisters who experience abstraction and offer them the Sacred Heart of Jesus in this month. I think that's a good thing too. Yeah. Well, good. Any other questions, comments, concerns, heresies?
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for coming, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank
Yeah, we'll see
you.
you next week. Bother the Father next week. Take some cake home with you if you like, please. That'd be great.
What's the difference between this and bother the father?
Okay.
Not much.
So
There's no cake.
there's okay.
Oh.
Yeah.